What is the number one responsibility of government? When Trump was running in 2016, he was asked to name the three most important functions of government. And he said national security, ding, education, healthcare, and that's the problem. And he's a Republican. Government has no business whatsoever being in the business, the federal government being in the business of healthcare. I know this is ancient history, but in 1965, when Congress passed the Medicare bill, initially, the AMA was opposed to it. Didn't want the big foot of government intruding in the business of healthcare. Because you're 65 years old, therefore you should have your healthcare paid for by taxpayers. What is that? Said a lot of doctors, including the AMA. They were won over, pounded down, bribed, felt that they could game the system to make it profitable for them. And you no longer hear any objection at all. But believe it or not, there was a fierce battle over whether or not the government could do this. Just as there was a fierce battle over whether or not FDR could impose his New Deal. I mean, the Supreme Court was striking that stuff down to the point where he got so angry, FDR did, that he threatened to do what Democrats are threatening to do right now, and that is to add more members of the Supreme Court, members whose philosophy would be consistent with his. And after he made that public threat, one of the justices that had been ruling against his New Deal suddenly started ruling in favor of it. His name, ironically, was Justice Roberts. And when I was in law school, there was a line, a switch in five saved nine. He went from being on the wrong end of a 5-4 to the other end of 5-4. A switch in five saved nine, meaning him switching saved the Supreme Court having the number of 9, which, by the way, is not magical. If you read the Constitution, nothing in there says anything about the members of the Supreme Court being limited to only 9, or any number for that matter. But the point is, the Constitution was used against FDR by the Supreme Court, and they said Article 1, Section 8, Commerce Clause, this, that, and the other. You can't do this. And remember, the Founding Fathers did not have an income tax, which is the primary source of income for the federal government. Why? Because the Founding Fathers did not want the federal government to be involved in fill in the blank. Medicare, Medicaid, building roads and bridges in somebody else's state. Education. And in 1900, believe it or not, government at all three levels took 10% of income from the American people. All three levels. Now it's close to 35%. And when you add a cost of mandates, and that's subjective, if government tells you you're running a factory, you have to buy this, do this, and you don't feel that you need to, or you don't feel you need to buy something as expensive as government mandates, that, in my opinion, is a cost. So you can figure all that in. Government takes almost half of the American people's income. And that's why we're trudging along at 2%, 3%, 4% GDP growth. Believe it or not, before the income tax, was not uncommon for us to have years of 5, 6, 7% income growth. Which means your net worth doubled every 10 years if you went at 7%. We ought to be talking about how we can limit the pile of stuff on the president's desk. If the president were focused on a laser beam like he should be on national security and didn't have to do all the other things that Congress and the American people are demanding that he does, something like this coronavirus crisis be on top of sooner, mitigate it faster, because that would be what the president would be devoting his or her time on. Not figuring out health care, not figuring out how we can protect pre-existing conditions. These were things that were not envisioned at all. Read Article 1, Section 8. Where do you see health care? Where do you see education? Where do you see disaster relief? Where do you see the Small Business Association? Where do you see Amtrak? Where do you see public broadcasting? We can't even get rid of public broadcasting. We can't even get rid of Amtrak. Amtrak loses millions, tens of millions every single year. And every single year they get funded. Why? If the government were the size the founding fathers intended for it to be, things like 9/11, why didn't they connect the dots? Why didn't they connect the dots? George W. Bush was in Florida reading to school children. Wonderful photo op, nice to read to school children. I want them to get a good education. Why is that the federal government's job